Technology is a good thing, a bad thing, and everything in between. I like to move away from the idea of either being for or against technology. I don't think you can be for or against technology any more than you can be for or against breathing air. It's just part of the way that we live in the 2020s. So it's much more interesting to think about what technologies are doing in our everyday lives, how technologies might be shaping the things we do, but also looking behind the scenes of technology. Who's actually kind of selling us the technology? Where's the money going? Who's benefiting from our technology? So I think it's a really, really interesting area to research. And it's much, much more complicated than just being good or bad, black or white. I think I'm interested in all the things in between.
Welcome to the Education Chapter. My name is Daniel Wiśniewski. I'm here with Professor Neil Selwyn from University of Monash in Melbourne, Australia. Professor Selwyn is an expert in sociology, and interestingly enough, he's also passionate about education and the use of technology in the education field. Neil, Professor Selwyn, thank you for accepting the invitation.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So we agreed before the recording that we're going to that I can call you by your first name, Neil. So I'm going to stick to that if it's okay. You're also a person that runs multiple podcasts, where one of them is actually about the use of technology in the education sector. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, what is your actual opinion about this? Is this a positive development or not? Because there's, of course, a lot of talking. One thing that we always have in our debates related to the use of technology is that is really technology using or solving any actual problems in the education sector? What do you think about this?
Technology is a good thing, a bad thing, and everything in between. I like to move away from the idea of either being for or against technology. I don't think you can be for or against technology any more than you can be for or against breathing air. It's just part of the way that we live in the 2020s. So it's much more interesting to think about what technologies are doing in our everyday lives, how technologies might be shaping the things we do, but also looking behind the scenes of technology. Who's actually kind of selling us the technology? Where's the money going? Who's benefiting from our technology? So I think it's a really, really interesting area to research. And it's much, much more complicated than just being good or bad, black or white. I think I'm interested in all the things in between. So you can always point to really positive, beneficial, educational uses of technology in a very specific context. I'm much more interested about what happens when you try and do the same thing in 10 other different contexts, and it doesn't quite work the same way. So I ask questions about context, and I ask questions about a political economy. There's all sorts of things you can ask. So technology is just here. It's not neutral, and I would never say it was just a tool and we shouldn't think about it. We should think a lot about it, and we should always ask very critical questions about it. But it way beyond being for or against. I'm talking to you on Zoom. I have a MacBook Air. I use technology all the time. So it'd be crazy for me to say I was completely opposed to it, but neither am I trying to sell you a product and trying to tell you that everything is fantastic. Mm-hmm. Things are clearly not fantastic.
And is this, okay, so then, okay, if this is your actual perspective, you say digitalization is here. And we should not just be talking about whether it's good or bad or whether we should use it or not, because we will have to use it. That's what the nature of nature is. But do you feel like, as a sociologist, do you see any actual changes that digitalization brought to the education worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, change is a really interesting thing to think about. So if you are very positive about technology, if you buy into the hype, then you'll say everything has changed, everything has been disrupted. Schools have been transformed. And if you go into a school, yes, things are very, very different than they even were 20 years ago. Every student will have a laptop. The teacher will have a laptop and a smartboard and a smartphone. There'll be a learning management system. The school will be linked up to all sorts of data. There may be AI technologies which are automating. Complete space age fantasy. From the more pessimistic point of view, though, you will actually say, well, actually, fundamentally, nothing has changed. there's a historian called Larry Cuban, and he talked about the grammars of schooling, the way that time is organized in schools by a timetable, the way that knowledge is kind of segmented in terms of a curriculum, the way that we test and assess. None of those things have fundamentally changed, even though we have all the superficial veneer of the laptops and the smartboard and the learning management system. So you could say, and Cuban had this phrase, computers have meet classroom, classroom wins. Nothing's really changed. I'm kind of in the middle. I think in reality, a lot of the teaching and the learning and the way we go about knowledge, and that's fundamentally the same, but technology is allowing students and teachers to do it quicker or do it more often or do it in different places. You know, the idea of learning at home, learning on the move. But fundamentally, the main changes, I think, are not instructional. They're institutional. They're to do with the way that the institution of the school or even the university is managed, about the administration, about bureaucracy. So the main technologies in schools today are the management systems, are the timetabling systems, are the systems which monitor and look for performance and try and measure and try and track. And those are the things that I think where the changes are really hitting. So it's not necessarily in how a child might learn to read or learn to do math or learn to socialize with their peers. It's to do with these bigger systems. And so the two shifts which I've been looking at in my own research recently are to do with data and data-driven technologies. And we talk a lot about datafication. The idea now in a school that a lot of things you do with technology will generate data, and that data is used to make profiles about you, to make dashboards about you, to make judgments about you. And I think datafication is a real change. And also automation. I think AI is very interesting. It's not as world changing as everybody makes out, but the idea of certain things being automated in a classroom now is an interesting change. And I'm interested to see how, so for example, AI tools are going to change the nature of teachers' work. If teachers are working alongside technologies which are automating very specific things, but actually making decisions and making judgments, what does it mean to be an expert teacher working in a classroom full of those technologies? You're no longer you're not using the technology, you're kind of working with the technology, or at least working alongside the technology. So changes there are occurring, but they're not positive, they're not negative. They're very complex. It's interesting to think about things. So nothing has changed, everything has changed, but we do need to ask questions about what are the outcomes and who's actually kind of benefiting from what's actually happening now with technologies.
Okay. I mean, I will challenge you on this though.
Go for it.
It's, we even have a joke here in Europe that's, and the joke really confirms your statement, saying that, in fact, when the technology meets the classroom, classroom wins, because we have a joke which says, in fact, education hasn't changed much. I mean, yes, we are using laptops, we are using PowerPoint. In the past, we used to use the chalk. Then we used to, we had a whiteboard. Then we started using PowerPoints, but the pedagogy of it, and the way the school is organized, and you say curriculum design and stuff like this is actually the same. So we kind of channeling technology to the old pipes, I would say. So
yeah, old wine in new bottles is the phrase
exactly.
that sometimes
That's biblical,
yeah.
Yes.
But what is different is all the stuff around it. So you might say, yes, the pedagogy is the same as it ever was. But I'm fascinated at the moment about who is actually kind of setting the pedagogical design of what takes place in classrooms. Is it the individual teacher? Is it the school they work in? Or is it people working for Google or Facebook or any of the big tech companies? Because as soon as you use a learning management system or a piece of a tutoring tool, the teacher has no control over the instructional design or the pedagogical design. So there are new actors involved. And so technologies are bringing in and making connections in a local school anywhere in Europe. The person who's in charge of how things are taught and even what is being taught could be millions of miles away. And I've never even been to that. So that's, I think, a fundamental shift. It's also bringing in other values and other interests and bringing in for-profit interests, for example, into public education. So I think that's a fundamental change. And there are lots of changes around the edges as well, because at the moment, we're just talking about the official curriculum, the official use of technology. I can be in a classroom and you can be teaching me history in the way that you've always taught me history for the past 40 years. But as a student, I could also have a smartphone out and I could be watching a TED talk or doing something on Wikipedia and finding out all sorts of other things whilst you're talking to me. It still looks the same, but there are fundamental different changes in what's going on. So I think it's really interesting to think about those sorts of things. And then there's all the stuff about non-formal and informal learning, because I can go home and do all sorts of really interesting creative stuff on a very small, cheap device and learn in all sorts of other interesting ways. So education has definitely changed. It's not the same as it ever was. A lot of the things, though, that have changed in schools and institutions, I don't think are necessarily beneficial for the learners or about learning. But as I've kind of hinted at, they're about the kind of organizational, institutional, the political structure of what schools are. So I think maybe 20 years ago, you could have said, if I was in a classroom in 1900, it would have been no different to a classroom in 2000. I think the classrooms of 2024 are different, not necessarily for the better, but I would no longer say old wine in new bottles.
Okay, but then, another, I mean, I'm going to be challenging you, I think, for this entire talk.
Of course.
We have been, we have just received PISA results. They were from last year. The PISA results, it's a program of international student assessment where we are trying to identify, how do students actually learn, what is their learning output and outcome in general. It's like, I think, the only international measure that allows us to compare us country by country and so on and so on. What we do see is that in most countries, actually, trends are downwards. And of course, we here in Europe, we've been blaming it quite a bit on COVID. Of course, partly it's true because, of course, we've been 2 years disrupted when it comes to the operation of the school. But at the same time, we also see that this trend normally started already before. And now the question is, can we blame digitalization for it? Why? Well, I don't know. It's like, in many of my talks here, when I talk about digitalization with different experts, they say, indeed, young people have changed because of the emergence of digitalization, and maybe we are teaching in the wrong way. Maybe it doesn't appeal to them. I don't know. What is your take on this? This is digitalization. Well, you said that digitalization is here, so we just have to accept it and live with it. I agree with it, but at the same time, did it actually bring good when it comes to learning outputs? Did it actually have, a kind of a positive impact on our youth?
Yeah, I mean, just to backtrack a couple of things you said, the PISA thing fascinates me looking from afar because lots of countries I work in are blaming PISA for a decline in results. For me, PISA tells us very, very little about what's going on in our education systems. It tells us how well students are doing PISA tests, and there are some self-report measures that they also have in PISA, but it doesn't tell you anything about what's going on in schools. And you can pick little bits of PISA data to prove anything you like. So my two favorite bits of PISA data from the recent PISA scores that you're talking about is there was a survey of which students said they hadn't tried at all hard on the tests, who had made no effort whatsoever. And I think it was Sweden, Australia, and Denmark. And I know for a fact that Sweden and Denmark are trying to use PISA as an excuse for getting rid of digital technologies. But if your students are not even trying on the tests, why are you worried about falling tests? It just means your students are being quite sensible and saving their energy for other things. And the other piece of PISA analysis, which I thought was fascinating, was done by some people in King's College London, which showed that the schools that had banned mobile phones had falling PISA scores. So if you ban a mobile phone from your classrooms and from your schools, your PISA scores go down. So what does that tell you? And clearly that doesn't mean, it's just showing that there's no kind of cause and effect that we can get from PISA. There's no correlation between technology and PISA scores, I don't think, myself.
Okay, but then I'm going to ask you $1 million question. How can we really make effective educational policy on the basis of what evidence? Because look, I mean, right now you can find evidence and research on everything, and you will have contradicting views all over the place. But how can we really make any effective educational policy? How can we really measure? So if I take your point of view on this, it's like we have no idea what's happening in our classroom. But then how can we as decision makers structure education in order to or even assess education in order to see what is the learning outcome of our kids. Can we?
Well, it depends. It depends whether you see as learning that something can be measured, and it's this whole kind of argument about quantification. I think teachers, good teachers, know very well what works in their own classrooms and how technology can help them, for example, and how technology can help their own students learn. So there's a wealth of expertise that you've got in classrooms that I think if you approach learning and technology not in a way that technology X causes learning Y to happen, but learning takes place in a very kind of complex context. Yeah. Technology is one variable, but there are lots of other variables. And when you put them all together, we know that often this will make this happen. And so what works in terms of technology use for a teacher in one context will not necessarily be scalable to a whole system. But what works for a teacher in a particular context with a particular type of student with a particular technology might be transferable to another teacher in a similar school with similar students with similar resources. Mm-hmm. So I think there are kind of local pockets of practice which can be borrowed, but you can never say we can scale this up to the whole system and this is the policy that works. I don't think there is any evidence that technology X will cause learning Y to happen. So that's, I think, is a fundamentally wrong way of trying to go about making policy. But we do know we have enough stories and we have enough experience. And if we share and we find ways of allowing education professionals to share their own experiences, you can then begin to have a pool of knowledge about what might work in a particular context. But it's never as simple as buying a particular computer or buying a particular system. It's all about, paying teachers well, having a good kind of, well-resourced school, having good school. You know this, there are lots of different things that can help. And it's often that you find the schools that make the best use of technology on the objective measures are the ones that do everything well. They have the best sports teams, the happiest students, the most well-paid teachers. They just have, they're good schools. So I'm much more about having a qualitative approach to what works and why, rather than trying to think that there's a particular measure or a particular variable. And so that's why I'm a little bit suspicious of PISA.
I see. So you're like you would be supporting this kind of community approach to school. So if a community is sort of happy with the learning outputs, the learning outcomes of the kids, that's fine. And we should, because we have a lot of discussion about this. It's like, how do we really measure that? How do we measure educational attainment? But I'm sure we cannot find the answer in this little talk that we are having here. But it's a really big question. It's like, how can we, promote policies that could actually work, and how can we really measure attainment? Because it's true. I mean, every person is different. Every person has different educational capabilities. So it's like some people even don't fit to school at all in the way it is. So it's really, really difficult for us to make any changes or any even assessment of that. But
I think policy is really important. And I'm not saying we need no policy whatsoever, but I think policies should enable and allow schools and allow teachers the flexibility to do things they think that work or that they find out that work. So a technology policy that completely is mandatory or bans particular technologies or says you have to do this, I think is too restrictive. But a technology policy that supports teachers to find out what works for them, learn from others what might work for them as well, and then actually supports them to do it, I think is really, really important. And also I'd like to say that there are lots of teachers that are passionate about technology and will do good things with that technology. There are lots of other teachers that do need policy support and do need guidance. So I think there's a really important part to pay for governments and policymakers to make sure that all teachers can benefit from the technology, because left to their own devices, schools and teachers, it tends to be the ones that are the best resourced and the most passionate and have the most time and the most energy will do the best things with technology. And technology ends up increasing disadvantage. It benefits more those that are already advantaged. And I think policymakers need to be really mindful of that.
Right. Okay, so if we take, let's say, your point of view, we kind of establish your point of view here. Can you name a few countries or regions where, this digital technologies in education have proven to be beneficial? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, I guess everything I've just said would kind of go against that, because I don't think you can necessarily prove that the technology is beneficial. The usual people that people will mention when you ask that question would be something like Estonia, for example, which had an amazing policy in 1996, the Tiger Leap policy, invested in getting, Estonia did things right in the 1990s, and that is still bearing fruit. People will also point to Uruguay, Plan Thebal, that's been running in Uruguay for 15 years now. I think is really interesting, giving devices to students and actually kind of making sure that the most disadvantaged communities and the most disadvantaged students got devices, and then setting up kind of national curricula and national online resources. That's worked really, really well. But no country is perfect. And so if you asked me this question when I first started in 1995, you would have said Singapore or South Korea. I mean, there's always been countries that people have pointed to as doing something right at a particular time, but then they change. So Sweden, for example, is a fascinating country. In the 1980s, built its own computer for schools, which is an amazing thing. And in the late 2010s, had a real push for digital competence and digitalization of schools. And so 5 years ago, I'd have said, look at Sweden. This year or last year, there's been a change in the politics of Sweden, a right-wing coalition, and all of a sudden the politicians are saying we need to get rid of devices from schools altogether and not have a digitalization strategy. So countries can change very quickly. So I think politics are interesting. So I'm much less interested in thinking of this country, we should all be like Estonia, or we should all be like Sweden. There are particular instances where national governments do interesting things. Sweden building its own computer, for example. I was having a conversation with a Finnish colleague last week, and we were talking about data and this idea about governments trying to collect lots of quantitative data, like you said about PISA. And he was saying, well, in Finland, they're going to have an experiment where they allow schools and early childhood centers to gather data together, but the data is not numeric. It's qualitative, it's stories, it's words, and it doesn't tell you exactly what they've found. It just gives you a resource to try and work things out for yourself from, which is a really interesting way of having a national education database. So I would say that's a brilliant example of thinking about data. But there are lots of other things that Finland does, which is terrible. So I think looking for the perfect country comes back to some of the things I was talking about previously. There is no one size fits all solution or one perfect story about technology use. You've got to think about context. And what works in Estonia or Uruguay or Singapore is very much to do about the local context of that country. Yeah. A lot of the countries and regions that you see people say, oh, this is what they're very small. The reason that Singapore or Ireland or Tasmania in Australia, the reason that they're seen to do good things with technology is that they're tiny geographically. They're very, very, very close together. So you can easily make a change to technology use in Singapore or Tasmania or Ireland than you could on the United States or Germany or a much bigger country. So I think I would move away from thinking about particular countries. I'd move away from thinking about particular kind of success cases and think much more about how do we begin to understand the different bits that make up a context in terms of technology using. And there is the technology, but then there's also, as I said, there's the demographic nature of the students, there's the history of the school, there's the resourcing of the education system, there's the governance that's built up around education. And technology is just part of that mix. And so what works in what country or what region or what school is very much to do with the whole picture, the bigger picture. And there are always good examples we can point to, but those examples are not necessarily going to scale to, your country or my country or across Europe.
Right. And what's, so speaking of, positive impact, what are the kind of positive impacts we can name with technology? I think you mentioned here that, we can use online resources, especially for people that could be, geographically excluded and so on. Then, of course, we can enhance learning, we can enhance communication. It's true that even the very functioning of the school, and I even would say that's, those communication structures and communication with parents have really changed. But what else can we really do besides that?
Yeah, coming to communication with parents is definitely a double-edged sword. I'm sure lots of teachers wish that they had less technology-based communication with parents. It's not necessarily a good thing. The one use case of digital technologies in education, which is generally seen to have worked and be beneficial, is to do with students with learning difficulties or physical disabilities, what is sometimes called special educational needs or learning needs, learning difficulties. There's some really interesting technologies which are very, very specific that I think have made huge changes to those groups of students. So adaptive technologies, for example, technologies that allow vision impaired students to engage with texts, for example, or allow students who have mobility issues to use voice to text. So that area of technology use is very, very specific, but there's some great examples there, even in terms of how technology can engage students with autism or other kind of neurodevelopmental disorders. Fantastic, but it's very specific and it's a very kind of niche area of technology. When we look elsewhere, then it becomes much, much more murky. As I said before, communication between students and teachers can be good, can also be terrible. It really depends on the context in which it's used. The technologies I'm really interested in, I think, have a positive potential, are probably the alternatives to all of the kind of the big tech managerialist technologies that I was talking about before. So I'm really interested in open education resources and open source technology models which allow people to actually kind of create technologies for themselves, share it with others, not necessarily through a big tech company or through a kind of procurement street. So open education resources are being pushed by the UN and UNESCO, and I think for a really good reason. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested in technologies like the Raspberry Pi. I don't know if you've seen them, these mini computers that are on a single board. They're almost like the computers from the 1980s, and you put little microchips in, and they're very, very rudimentary, but they're fascinating educational resources because students learn from building the technology and putting it together. Technology in schools does not have to be sophisticated. We don't have to all have MacBooks and, the technologies of the boardroom. Technologies can be very simple. So I think those are really interesting. I'm also really fascinated by the use of alternate ways of setting up things like platforms. So there's lots of arguments that platforms are now very kind of top down and regimented and, built by commercial corporate profit for commercial corporate interests. There's a whole different range of platform cooperativism where platforms are put together on a cooperative basis and actually run by workers for workers' own needs. And there's these kind of community-led technologies, which I think are really interesting when they come into schools. And I'm fascinated about more rugged technologies. I think COVID and other climate change issues we're seeing are seeing the need for uses of technology and technology practices which are a little bit more resilient. So I'm really interested about recycling and reusing and repairing technologies, not just buying new technologies every 3 years. So there are lots of really interesting bits of technology around the edges, which I'm beginning to play around with for various reasons. They're not necessarily the ones that are going to kind of, make your PISA scores go up by 20%, but they may be for the future prove to be much, much more reliable, resilient, interesting, fun, resistant.
Well, listening to you, I thought I was coming up with a sort of a unexpected question, I would say. So, I mean, you speak a lot about the technology sphere coming to school, and I think even also university level. I would say that the COVID-19 has transformed the schools in some ways, but particularly it's changed the business model of universities. Universities have now become multinational organizations with lots of different campuses and so on. We can teach online. We have lectures that are being recorded and so on and so on. But it also led to, and that's something that's a relatively new trend, where you mentioned here the open resources, but there's lots of corporations kind of looking into this space and trying to, well, capture a bit of that cake where it comes to education in general. So you have Google and other big corporates looking into developing micro-credentials, what we call micro-credentials. So these are these kind of certificates about certain skills that would certify your skills. So my question is, can Google get you out of your job as a university professor?
Oh yeah, universities. I'm interested. Do you think COVID has changed schools? I'd like to talk to you about that because I don't think COVID has changed anything, which really worries me.
I think
in schools,
no, but universities.
No. Yeah, and yeah, definitely. In terms of the technology use, COVID, I think this is a real shame. I think we should have learned so much from what happened in COVID, and we should now be changing so much on the basis of that we are forgetting all of the really important lessons in schools. But in universities, as you say, I think COVID was a tipping point. Lots of those changes were taking place already. We had micro credentials for the past 20 years, digital badges, all sorts of different things. And Google had their own kind of certification before COVID, but COVID has been a tipping point. I think for universities, it's really pushed universities into thinking in a hybrid model. And actually, the idea of an online lecture or a fully online course or an online degree is now perfectly accepted by universities, primarily because a lot of students are demanding it. Because I think COVID broke the contract between students coming into campus and sitting in a classroom for 45 minutes. They realized that was no longer necessary. So universities are trying to change their product because of that. But at the same time, as you said, there are lots of other corporate entities trying to say that they can do the job better, quicker, cheaper, on a larger scale. I don't think it's going to necessarily happen this time around anywhere apart from perhaps computer science. I think if I wanted to become a Google engineer or work in computer science, I might well do one of those accelerated micro-credential courses that's run by corporate, because in that industry, I think those credentials probably do hold more weight. I still think if I wanted to learn literature or history or, particle physics, I would still go to a university, but I'd probably want to do it online. And I would probably be looking at 101 other online resources from other universities at the same time. But I think there is a kind of momentum there that over time, the university sector, the higher education sector, is shifting. I don't think personally I'll be out of a job, because I think if you're smart enough, you will adapt and you will, you'll embrace some of these changes. And a lot of what's actually having to change in universities is probably needing to be changed. If you look at the big disruption at the moment around assessment, so COVID really had problems in terms of face-to-face examinations. How do we do that? You could argue that face-to-face examinations were, an obsolete way of doing things anyway. The same with the long-form essay. If you're asking your students to write a long-form essay in response to a prompt, and you're finding out that they're using generative AI to do it, then perhaps that mode of assessment wasn't the right way of doing it. So I think smart universities and smart professors will try and change and adapt and embrace some of these issues and see where there's value in actually changing what we do, and fundamentally think about what is it that is the unique added value of having a human expert, not necessarily in a room, but a human expert curating your learning experience and engaging you as a person, as a human, in learning about something. And I think if we can think about that, then there still will be room for human professors and maybe even classrooms occasionally. But higher education, COVID and everything around it has tipped us. What interests me is why schools haven't also followed suit. And I don't think there's been half the learning that could have taken place from COVID and technology that there should have been. Schools have kind of gone back to where they were before, which is understandable, but I think we've missed an opportunity there.
Well, maybe I can try to give you an answer to this, because we did try to identify those, and we came to the conclusion that the universities do not provide care. They are there for other people, whereas schools are needed because if they not only provide education, but they also provide care, which frees the parents to go and work, isn't it? So that was, it's actually quite scary, because then we realized that we are we are more carers than educators, and that's that in fact people value us not because we educate. Well, we educate and they value it, but what they really are concerned about is, where will I leave my kid when I have to go to work?
Which is worrying. If that's
worrying.
all people want you to do, then you may as well just get a bunch of childcare professionals at half the wages, and then we can just make the kids follow programmed instruction. So I think so. There's something, when you said that to begin with, I was thinking, well, actually, a lot of the things we should have learned from COVID about universities is that maybe universities should put more emphasis on care and the relational elements of the students that we're working with and we're responsible for. And also things like trust. And there are all sorts of other kind of more affective elements of education, which COVID kind of spiked and showed, and then everyone kind of forgot about. But I think, one of the reasons that people are perhaps not very sympathetic towards universities is they're not really places of care. They are just places of, transactionally giving you the knowledge to give you a degree. So we need to change that element of higher education. But I think schools are more than just places for people to dump their kids while they go to work. I mean, particularly if they're working from home, there's no need necessarily now for that. So I think there are lots of things we could have rethought schools in a way that did really tease out what it meant to come together in the same place for 5 hours or 6 hours a day, what it was that made that special. And it's not just about jumping kids off to go to work. I think there's all sorts of things about the socialization factor of being in school, learning what it is to be a member of a community, to be a citizen, learning about what it is to be with other people, as well as all the things you can learn as a group, learn collectively. If you just learn on your own all the time, then I think you become a very narrow learner. Whereas, learning with other people is fascinating because you can challenge each other all the time. You can have different thoughts. There are all sorts of reasons for having face-to-face schooling. But it's interesting that we've gone back to exactly the same way of doing face-to-face schooling as we did pre-pandemic. But anyway, maybe that's a conversation for another podcast.
Let's finish this then, like with this statement, because I think it's a strong statement at the end. Neil, thanks a lot for your time. For our viewers, if you like this, what you've been watching, just give us a like, give us a subscription. Then you can, of course, be informed about our future movies, future episodes. What does technology change in your community? Did your school change? I think that Neil said we could have do better. What do you think about that? Can we do better? Could we change more the school sector thanks to the digitalization and using the COVID as a pretext? Tell us what you think about this. Leave us a comment and stay tuned. See you next episodes. Have a good day.